Thus far, we've dealt with the responsibility of African leaders from certain tribes capturing and selling members of other vulnerable tribes to the Europeans. The Europeans bringing the captives to America and then forcefully converting them into Negroes, N-words, and black people. And this was done through a most vicious and brutal version of slavery that the world had never seen. This slavery experience significantly altered their consciousness, character, and culture. And it did it in such a way to make them ideal slaves for those who would eventually become known as white people. Now we will deal with a pivotal point in history where a major event occurred that shook up the foundations of the chattel slavery system that they had set up. And that event is known as the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And the book that we're going to study from is this 1979 book called Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, by historian and black history scholar Dr. Leon Litwack. Now, is he of the light complexion? Yeah, so what? This is a great book, and that's all that matters. And what really makes it a great book is that in here, it draws from source material from over 2,000 blacks that were interviewed after the Civil War. So we're talking about firsthand testimony of people who actually lived through the time, right? And it also has some diary accounts in here from the white Southerners who give their perspective on the events as well, right? So it's about as best as you can get without actually having experienced it yourself, right? So it's a highly recommended book because it bridges the gap between the end of slavery and then coming into the beginning of life afterwards, right? So let's go on here and we're going to turn to page 3 where he writes this. On the eve of the Civil War, the more than 4 million slaves and free blacks comprised nearly 40% of the population of the South. These are 4 million blacks. Now let's go to the preface real quick to see what the author knows about these blacks. For many of them, the only world they knew ended at the boundaries of the plantations and farms on which they toiled. Most of them were several generations removed from the African immigrants who had been torn from their homeland and shipped in chains to the New World. Most of the people known as blacks were several generations removed from the actual authentic ancestors from Africa who were brought over. The distant voices of Africa still echoed in their music, in their folk tales, in the ways they worshiped God, and in their kinship relationships. These were distant voices, very faint, lower than whispers that still remained. But in 1860, they were as American as the whites who lorded over them. They were no longer Africans, just like most of the whites were no longer Europeans at this time. The transition had already been made. The earlier Europeans, like the English, the Irish, and the Dutch, morphed into white Americans, just as the early Africans, like the Igbo, Mindi, and Yoruba, were turned into Negroes, N-words, and black people. And Dr. Litwack knows this, which is why he could write this sentence. So now we know exactly who were the 4 million slaves and free blacks who made up the 40% of the South's population. Although most slaveholders owned less than 10 slaves, the majority of slaves worked as field hands on plantation-sized units which held more than 20 slaves, and at least a quarter of the slave force lived in units of more than 50 slaves. Even without the added disruption of war, the awesome presence of so many blacks could seldom be ignored. While to the occasional visitor they might blend picturesquely into the landscape and seem almost inseparable from it, native whites were preoccupied with their realities. What reality? The reality that there were so many blacks as the war approached. The outsiders thought it a sight to see, but to the native whites, this was something to seriously consider. Oftentimes, in fact, they could talk of little else, wavering between moods of condescension, suspicion, and hostility. Slave-holding families acknowledged by their conversations and daily conduct a relationship with their blacks that was riddled with ambiguity. They talked down on the blacks, but yet they were heavily dependent on them. They presented themselves as dominant, yet they still had underlying fears. These contradictions created a relationship full of tension and ambiguity as the war approached. When the Civil War broke out, with the attendant problems of military invasion and plantations stripped of their white males, that ambiguity would assume worrisome dimensions for some. It would lure others into a false sense of security,
and it would drive still more into fits of anguish.
Their reactions varied just as did the reactions of their black slaves. And we're going to see all of this throughout our studies on this topic and see just how much it varied. And it's important because it teaches us some very subtle lessons in here.
Within easy earshot of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Mary Boykin Chestnut, whose husband was an extensive planter and political leader in South Carolina, tried in vain to penetrate behind the inscrutable faces of her servants. Why did they not betray some emotion or interest? How could they go about their daily chores seemingly unconcerned that their own destiny might be in the balance but a few miles away?
Here's what she wrote.
Not by one word or look can we detect any change in the demeanor of these Negro servants. Lawrence sits at our door, as sleepy and as respectful and as profoundly indifferent. So are they all. They carry it too far.
Meaning they were too excessive in their demeanor, which made her a bit suspicious.
You could not tell that they even hear the awful noise that is going on in the bay, though it is dinning in their ears night and day, and people talk before them as if they were chairs and tables, and they make no sign.
While guns fired and cannons blasted, the slaves acted as if it was just another day. She was worried and she couldn't understand how they were so unfazed through all of this chaos.
This almost studied indifference obviously troubled Mary Chestnut as much as it might have comforted and reassured her.
Are they stolidly stupid?
She wondered.
Or wiser than we are, silent and strong, biding their time?
Which one was it? Were they too ignorant to comprehend or more prudent than she had once believed? She couldn't tell at this moment.
The slaves were no less observant of their white folks. Although blacks had always been aware of frailties in their owners, the system of slavery had been based on the acknowledged power of the white man. But the Civil War introduced tensions and tragedies into the lives of masters and mistresses that made them seem less than omnipotent, perhaps even suddenly human in ways blacks had thought impossible. Rarely had slaves perceived their owners so utterly at the mercy of circumstances over which they had no control.
What circumstance? The war, how it would end, what the results would be, and so forth. This was the first time that most of the slaves witnessed whites in such an uncertain event without having much control over it. They were accustomed to Big Bad Massa having it all figured out. He writes,
Never before had they seemed so vulnerable, so beleaguered, so helpless, unprecedented in the disruptions, stresses, and trauma it generated among both whites and blacks. The Civil War threatened to undermine traditional relationships and dissolve long-held assumptions and illusions.
Like what? Blacks as inferior and whites as superior? Blacks as slaves and whites as the masters? Blacks as only being fit for slaves and whites being only fit to rule over them? This was the relationship and a few of the long-held assumptions that were normal and accepted for over 200 years at that point by most of the society, including most of the slaves. And the Civil War threatened to undermine this.
Even if many slaves evinced a human compassion for masters and mistresses caught in the terrible plight of war, invasion, and death, how long before these same slaves came to recognize that in the very suffering of their white folks lay their own freedom and salvation?
It would be sooner than later for some. Now, during the earlier months of the war, neither blacks nor whites fully comprehended the extent of it. Some of the whites who appeared proud and boastful were really not as certain as they portrayed themselves. The case was thus, as recalled by one slave.
You thought the Confederates going to win the war?
John Wright speculated after hearing Jefferson Davis address an enthusiastic crowd in Montgomery, Alabama.
But I noticed Massa Wright look right solemn when we go back home. Don't believe he ever was sure the South going win.
The slave could tell because they were keen at observing their master's mood, their facial expressions, their entire aura, everything about them. And this master didn't look too sure when he got home. Now, other people didn't have the same reaction as the war cracked off.
When the soldiers prepared to leave for the front, the festivities gave way to sobering farewells that made a deep impression on some of the blacks.
Miss Polly and the ladies got to crying,
recalled Sarah DeBrow, who spent the war years as a young house slave in a North Carolina family.
I was so sad that I got over in the corner and cried too.
Why did she cry? It's plausible that she looked at those ladies as family and she felt empathy for them. But with all this crying and uncertainty taking place at that time, there were still others who did feel certain that the South would be victorious, and in an easy fashion at that. A North Carolina planter told his slave this:
"There is a war commenced between the North and the South. If the North whoops, you will be as free a man as I is. If the South whoops, you will be a slave all your days."
Before leaving, the master jokingly told the slaves that he expected to whoop the North and be back for dinner.
He was confident and bold, all right, but listen to this.
He went away,
One of his slaves recalled.
and it was 4 long years before he come back to dinner. The table was sure set a long time for him. A lot of the white folks said they wouldn't be much war. They could whoop them so easy. Many of them never did come back to dinner.
It was more than they thought that they had to chew on. They believed that they could run right over the North, and boy, were they in for a surprise. How much of a surprise? Death and destruction everywhere.
The scenes witnessed by slaves in the aftermath of battles fought near their homes would never be forgotten. Martha Cunningham, who had been raised near Knoxville, Tennessee, recalled walking over hundreds of dead soldiers lying on the ground and listening to the groans of the dying.
Think about that as a slave, seeing hundreds of dead bodies and listening to the groans of people taking their last dying breaths. That sight must have been super tragic.
William Walters and his mother, both of them fugitives from a plantation in Tennessee, watched the wounded being carried to a clearing across the road from where they had sought refuge.
Fighting men with arms shot off, legs gone, faces blood smeared, some of them just laying there cussing God and man with their dying breath.
Experiencing the depths of hellfire and brimstone. In this condition was how many of the soldiers returned back home. Here we go.
Few slaves were immune to the human tragedies that befell the families to whom they belonged. They had known them too well, too intimately not to be affected in some way.
Us was boys together, me and Mars Hampton, and we's just about the same size.
Abram Harris recalled.
It sure did hurt me when Mars Hampton got killed, 'cause I loved that white man.
He said, what? Let's hear it again.
It sure did hurt me when Mars Hampton got killed, 'cause I loved that white man.
How could he be a slave and say that he loved that white man? Because he was likely a slave that was treated fairly by his master. He probably felt like he was part of the family, just like pet dogs do. So it hurt him when his master was killed because he loved that white man. And he wasn't the only one.
The tragedies that befell the Lipscomb family in South Carolina provoked one of their slaves, Lorenza Ezell, beyond mere compassion to outright anger and a desire for revenge. As he would later remember that reaction,
All 4 of my young masters go to the war, all but Elias. He too old. Smith, he killed at Manassas Junction. Nathan, he get his finger shot at the first round at Fort Sumter. But when Billy was wounded at Howard Gap in North Carolina, and they brung him home with his jaw split open, I so mad I could have killed all the Yankees.
His other masters who were killed or injured didn't bother him as much, but when they cracked Billy's jaw open, they could have given him a rifle and he would have killed all the Yankees who were fighting to release him from slavery. Why? Because he loved his master. You may not understand it, but many of these people had a mind filled with ideas that reinforced their position as a slave. And some would risk their life and even kill to remain in that position, just like the gentleman here who would kill all the Yankees for what they did to his master Billy. He says,
I say I'd be happy if and I could kill me just one Yankee. I hated them 'cause they hurt my white people. Billy was disfigure awful when he jaw split and he teeth all shine through he cheek.
nothing you can do for him. He has to be left behind because the ideas in his mind make him a liability. There's no saving him, there's no convincing him or anything like that. He is what he is. And that's perfectly fine. Let's continue.
The sight of a once powerful white man reduced to an emotional or physical cripple, returning home without a leg or an arm, looking so ragged and ornery as to be barely recognizable, generated some strong and no doubt some mixed emotions in the slaves, as did the spectacle of the whites grieving over a death. That was the first time, Nancy Smith recalled,
I had ever seen our mistress cry. She just walked up and down in the yard a wringing her hands and crying. Poor Benny's been killed, she would say over and over.
After witnessing such scenes, another ex-slave recalled,
You would cry some without letting your white folks see you.
Same thing. These were people they saw as family. These were people that they saw and interacted with on a daily basis. And if they were unfamiliar with the Yankees and had little interest in freedom, then you can see how they might respond by crying after seeing their owners come from the war with missing legs and arms or dead, right? Now, all the slaves did not respond this way. Let's get that clear. Some slaves had the opposite response.
If the plight of their masters moved some slaves to tears, that was by no means a universal reaction. Grief and the forced separation from loved ones were hardly new experiences in the lives of many slaves. To witness the discomfiture of white men and women suffering the same personal tragedies and disruptions they had inflicted on others might produce ambiguous feelings at best, or even be a source of immense gratification. Delia Garlick, for example, was working as a field hand on a Louisiana plantation when the war broke out. Born in Virginia and sold 3 times, she had been separated from the rest of her family.
Dem days was hell.
She would recall of her bondage.
Babies was snatched from their mother's breasts and sold to speculators. Chillins was separated from sisters and brothers and never saw each other again. Course they cry. You think they not cry when they was sold like cattle? It's bad to belong to folks that own you soul and body, that can tie you up to a tree, with your face to the tree and your arms fastened tight around it, who take a long curling whip and cut the blood ever lick. Folks a mile away could hear them awful whippings. They was a terrible part of living.
The most vivid impression she retained of the war was the day the master's 2 sons left for military service, and the obvious grief that caused her owners.
When they went off, the massa and missus cried, but it made us glad to see them cry. They made us cry so much.
You see that? She enjoyed watching the tears and suffering of her owners. She never forgot about all the times where she was sold and she had to cry, or how many times babies were taken from other mothers who were left crying, right? She didn't forget about any of that. She still remembered it, and it made them glad to see them cry when their sons went off to battle. And they probably wished they died too, right?
On the plantation in Alabama where Henry Baker spent his childhood, the news spread quickly through the slave quarters that Jeff Coleman, a local white man who once served on the detested slave patrols, had been killed in the war.
Jeff Coleman, one of the whites who couldn't wait to catch him in N-word, was killed, and the news spread fast.
The niggas just shouted and shouted.
Baker recalled.
They was so glad he was dead because he was so mean to them.
Thank God, hallelujah, in the name of Jesus, dancing and shuffling all in the quarters when they heard the news. So we can see that responses were mixed, and that's because their mentalities were different. We've got a lot more to cover on this topic, so definitely stay tuned. I thank you right now for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.